Okay, so here we go. I'm going to introduce Sukjong Hong, who is a reporter, researcher at the New Republic with a background in architecture and urban planning, and an artist working on graphic novels. She was a 2014 commissioned artist with the Laundromat Project, a 2014 Guardian Diversity Writers Workshop participant, and a 2012-2013 Open City Magazine Creative Nonfiction Fellow here at the workshop. She is currently working with a collective of artists to interpret oral histories of Asian American communities in New York, with support from the Queens Council for the Arts and the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. Her writing has appeared or is forthcoming in Tin House, Fusion News, Al Jazeera America, Gothamist, Triple Canopy Magazine, Racialicious, Hyphen Magazine, The Feminist Wire, and The Feminist Wire, among others. She writes about immigration, labor, cities, militarism, and East Asian politics with a focus on Korea and social movements. Here she comes.
Okay, hello everyone. So thank you all for coming to tonight's reading and event. I'm very excited to be here moderating the event. And just to start, I wanted to talk briefly about North Korea, which is a place that few of us have accessed and is a country that fascinates many. But from our vantage point in the United States, it is often demonized or simplified into a monolithic image or a figure where the primary stories revolve around its leadership or the regime, or around a theme of darkness, impenetrability, unknowability, and fear. But tonight's event is North Korean stories. So when we do hear about North Korean people and society, it is often from those who have left. Well, the stories of those who have stayed are often unheard or cast in suspicion. So this really raises a quandary for a lot of us about, as the title of this event raises, which is, what is a North Korean story? And what does it mean that a lot of North Korean stories that we do hear are from the vantage point of defectors and refugees? What are the stories that we have heard, and are there stories that we have yet to hear? So for many of us who are Korean Americans, and I think there are many of us in the audience, including myself, North Korea is also a country where we have family and where we have some tenuous connection and maybe some half-remembered relatives. So there's still a tie that kind of lingers despite the division, which has lasted for 68 years. And so this is a very special and strange privilege we have in the United States. We are actually able to travel technically to North Korea, although the same kind of privilege is not available to those in South Korea. And so what do we do with the silences, as well as the media coverage, as well as a lot of the sensational news coverage? And I think for a lot of us, we try to think about how is there a way to go beyond the binary of the Cold War, where North Koreans are often presented very simplistically as like a zombie people, or brainwashed, or people that have no will or agency. And as someone who has worked on, listened to various social movements in South Korea, I think it's very kind of promising to think about literature and culture and certain kinds of journalism as kind of opening and bridging these very long and painful divides. So today we're going to hear the work of two authors who have chosen to tell North Korean stories based on the texture of individual lives and struggles, especially of North Koreans who have left their country to make the long journey through China into South Korea. So I want to welcome Krys Lee, whose new novel, How I Became a North Korean, is one of the most anticipated books of 2016 by the Millions and other outlets, and also National Book Award nominated journalist Barbara Demick, author of Nothing to Envy. So can we give a round of applause for these women? So first I'd like to welcome Barbara Demick to read. She is the author of Nothing to Envy, Ordinary Lives in North Korea, a finalist for the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle, and winner of the Samuel Johnson Prize. To research the book, Demick interviewed about 100 defectors and honed in on the lives of 6 North Korean citizens in Cheongjin. The book spans a 15-year period that saw the death of Kim Il-sung, the rise to power of his son, Kim Jong-il, and a devastating famine that killed 1/5 of the population. The 2009 book now has a new afterword and was republished in 2015. As The Telegraph writes, the stories it recounts are moving and disturbing, and it surely tells us far more about real North Korean lives than a fleeting tourist visit to the Stalinist kitsch theme park that is Pyongyang. The former Beijing bureau chief of the Los Angeles Times, she is also the author of Logavina Street, Life and Death in a Sarajevo Neighborhood. Let's welcome Barbara Demick.
I don't think I have that much more to say about how this book was done. I was based in Seoul. I was Seoul bureau chief before moving to Beijing. And I was there from 2001 to 2006. And it was a period where it was really very difficult for US citizens to get into North Korea. It was, I arrived just about the time of George W. Bush's Axis of Evil speech. And there was really no explaining to the North Koreans that we didn't necessarily all support George W. So there was kind of a blanket ban on US citizens. And I spent about 4 years writing pathetic letters, asking to be let in. And by about 2005, 2006, it became a little bit easier, but I became, as a result, quite obsessed with North Korea. If you know any journalists, they're always, if there's something that they're not allowed to cover, probably be really interested. If we had all been invited to North Korea, we probably would have said, oh, crappy food, bad lodgings, let's not go. But I was one of those who was obsessed. And in my book, anyway, I tried to interview just about every defector who was coming out from North Korea. Most of the North Koreans come at least as their second stop. They come through China, but they come to South Korea. They go through a whole sort of capitalist indoctrination program, and then they're sort of let loose. And there were various associations helping them. And so I started, just like compulsively, like every week I would interview 2 North Koreans, and I got this idea of forming a portrait of their lives. The book focuses on 6 people, and one of the people who I'm going to read about, her name is Dr. Kim, and Kim Jin, actually is her full name, and she was a little higher. She was a pediatrician in North Korea, and she was exceedingly loyal to the regime. She tried many times to join the Workers' Party and failed. Never intended to become a defector. And I will read to you about her experience. One thing you need to know about her is her father was born in China. There are a lot of ethnic Koreans in China. They call them Joseonjok. And a lot of these people moved to North Korea during the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution, because there was actually more to eat in North Korea in those years than in China. And in North Korea, people who had relatives in China were considered suspect. Everybody is ranked by their class ranking, and if you had a relative in China, a relative in Japan or South Korea too, but in China, your ranking was low, and but her relatives in China end up being helpful. So I will read. Dr. Kim had quit pediatrics in 1997. She couldn't bear looking into the eyes of starving children any longer. She switched to research, hoping that it would keep her from having to deal with dying people, but there were no conditions in which to do research. After breakfast, the doctors were preoccupied with finding food for dinner, and after dinner, they worried about the next breakfast. She began leaving work early to scavenge in the mountains for edible weeds. Sometimes she'd chop wood to sell. Her weight had fallen below 80 pounds. Her breasts shriveled and she stopped menstruating. From afar, she looked more like a 12-year-old child than a woman in her early 30s. The first few days she'd gone without eating. She felt so hungry she would have stolen food from a baby. But after 4 days or so, she felt nothing at all but a strange sensation that her body was not her own, that she was being lifted into the air and dropped down again. She had no strength to get up in the morning. She quit her volunteer position at the party secretariat, and by early 1998 had stopped going to work entirely. She tried various ways to make money. She sold alcohol or coal at the market. She didn't lament the waste of her medical school training. At the height of the famine, it was enough to stay alive. On one of her excursions to the market, she ran into an old friend. They had been classmates in high school, both of them the kind of popular smart girls who might have been voted most likely to succeed. Her friend had been a class officer. They made polite small talk, telling each other they looked well, even though they were both sallow and emaciated. Then Dr. Kim inquired about her classmate's family. Her classmate told her matter-of-factly her husband and her 2-year-old son had died, just 3 days apart. Dr. Kim tried to offer her condolences. "Oh, I'm better off. Fewer mouths to feed," the classmate told Dr. Kim. Dr. Kim couldn't decide whether her friend was callous or insane, but she knew that if she stayed in North Korea any longer, she would be the same. Before he died, Dr. Kim's father had given her a list of his relatives' names and last known addresses in China. It was a suicide note of sorts. Her father had scribbled it in a shaking hand during the delirium of his self-imposed starvation. Her father refused to eat after Kim Il-sung died and basically starved himself to death. At the time, Dr. Kim was offended by the list. She remained loyal to the memory of North Korea, but she hadn't thrown away. She dug out the little box in which she had stored it, carefully unfolded the paper, and looked at the names. She remembered what her father had said: "They will help you." Dr. Kim left for China alone. She couldn't afford to hire a guide or bribe the border guards, so she had to rely solely on her wits and instinct. By March 1999, enough people were making the trip that you could pick up tips in border towns about the best spots to cross. The early spring landscape was just beginning to thaw out from an exceptionally bitter winter, and the Tumen was still frozen. Dr. Kim went to a spot she'd heard you could walk across. She brought stones with her, and every few feet she would throw a stone to test the thickness of the ice. At least on the North Korean side, it was solid. She slid 1 foot forward, then the next, delicate as a ballerina. She made it about halfway before her stone disappeared into a puddle of slush. She followed anyway, and the freezing water came up to her waist. She cleared a path with her hands as if breaking through the icebergs. Dr. Kim staggered up the riverbank. Her legs were numb, encased in frozen trousers. She made her way through the woods until the first light of dawn illuminated the outskirts of a small village. She didn't want to sit down and rest. She feared succumbing to hypothermia, but she knew she didn't have the strength to go much farther. Dr. Kim looked down a dirt road that led to farmhouses. Most of them had walls around them with metal gates. She tried one. It turned out to be unlocked. She pushed it open and peered inside. On the ground, she saw a small metal bowl with food. She looked closer. It was rice, white rice, mixed with scraps of meat. Dr. Kim couldn't remember the last time she'd seen a bowl of pure white rice. What was a bowl of rice doing there, just sitting out on the ground? She figured it out just before she heard the dogs bark. Up until that moment, a part of her had hoped that China would be just as poor as North Korea. She still wanted to believe that her country, North Korea, was the best country in the world. The beliefs had cherished her for a lifetime, and these beliefs would be vindicated when she got to China. But now she couldn't deny what she was staring at plainly in the face. Dogs in China ate better than doctors in North Korea.
Wow.
I think when you hear from Krys and read her marvelous novel, you'll see that we cover some of the same material from a different approach. So I will turn it over.
Hello again. So now I want to welcome Krys Lee, who will read from her new debut novel, How I Became a North Korean. Krys is an assistant professor at Yonsei University, Underwood International College in South Korea. She previously read at AAWW for her award-winning short story collection, Drifting House. She is a recipient of the Rome Prize and the Story Prize Spotlight Award, the honor title in adult fiction literature from the Asian Pacific American Libraries Association, and a finalist for the BBC International Story Prize. The title story of Drifting House also includes a story of North Korean siblings crossing into China to escape starvation. And about her latest book and her first novel, in the words of Adam Johnson, a Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award-winning author, he says, Lee forges a world no other writer could create, one where the only response to longing and loss is learning to trust and hope again. In Krys Lee's new novel, the three main characters must struggle to survive together when they find themselves in a small Chinese town just across the river from North Korea. Yongju, a student from a prominent North Korean family, Changmi, a smuggler who's had to fend for herself since childhood, and Danny, an ethnic Korean Chinese teenager from California who returns to China. So let's welcome Krys Lee.
Perfect. First, I just want to thank the AAWW. It's an incredible space. It's grown so much, and it's done a lot to support writers that I think have a hard time finding a voice in the major media outlets occasionally because of all sorts of political reasons I won't get into. And thank you so much for Sukjong Hong for moderating and taking the time to read our books and think about our work. And for Barbara, who has been, her nonfiction work and her articles as well has been so important to both knowledge, but also just so sensitively written that it was a very important kind of model, I think, for both fiction and nonfiction writers alike. The novel, one of the inspirations for the novel was not only, my friendships and relationships with the North Korean refugee community and friends and activists, in South Korea, as well as my own, what I call accidental activism that I became involved in as a result when people you care about have lost so much and had their lives threatened and their families taken away from them for reasons out of their control. But also, specifically, at least the passage that I'm going to read today, because I had a short period of time where I was working at the border area. I was called to set up a safe house. And I saw that everything I had known over the years and everything I thought was the reality of the North Korean refugee situation and the humanitarian work that was happening, and what I call the border, what I believed was the border, was not actually the real border that I believed in, was not the stories that I had heard and understood in South Korea and in the media. And this particular bit, we chose a companion piece to kind of play with fiction and nonfiction and the relationship between the same material. It's about a woman named Changmi who crosses, but she was actually inspired by a man who I was working with to set up the safe house. And in the process of knowing him, I also entered his life at a time when he was trying to marry a North Korean refugee and trying to bring her over. So I was part of the negotiations, I had conversations with her on the phone, and I was there to see that relationship change and turn into suspicion and mistrust via phone, because for various reasons she never came. But my question always was to myself, what if she had come? What would have happened? And this became her story. Changmi. In late February or early March, I walked across the frozen Tumen River toward a man from China, ready to give my unborn child a different life. Of course my crossing had started much earlier, maybe with a great hunger, or even before I was born. The China beyond the river that day was as dried up and as brown as my country. I walked with the eyes of men and women following me from both sides of the shore. I remember being hopeful that the riverbanks were still hoary with the remaining snow. A border patrol who the man from China had bribed followed me across. There were broad, dark patches where the ice looked as thin as glass, but I was from a border town. I'd smuggled goods in and out since I was 14 and knew how to read the river. I looped around where the ice became dangerously clear until I was standing in the center of the frozen river and facing the man from China, a Chosonjo, so he spoke our language. He had an eager smile and a small head. He was small everywhere, it seemed, and he limped slowly forward as if needing my permission to come closer. With every step, his left leg swung out rigidly in a semicircle until we faced each other. He was nervous. His right foot kept making circles on the ice behind him like a ballerina. This man named Songshik said, "You really do believe me now, don't you? I'm a person who can make these kinds of meetings happen. I know everyone, and everyone knows me. Money? Who needs money? You need connections." He tore skin from his lower lip with his teeth. He wanted my approval. The way he repeated himself made that clear. But we didn't have much time, so I interrupted him. "I learn fast," I said. "I'll learn anything you want." I shut my eyes tight so I wouldn't have to look at him. When I opened them, he was still shyly taking me in. The shy ones were the worst, hard to read. "Why do you want to leave?" he asked, as if half my country, the country of his ancestors, didn't dream of living differently. I was so nervous that my fingers dug arcs into my palms. "There are no good men in my country," I said. He brightened, as I'd intended. "I'm a good man, I promise." While the border guard smoked an imported cigarette from the many cases I'd given him to keep him happy, the Chosun man and I hurried through the 10 minutes of time we had to talk, the courting time that he had bought for us. Money was a symbol, a disease that infected our country. It was all the money I'd earned after quitting school during the Great Hunger, my life savings, you could call it. I was 8 when the famine changed everything. After the government rations stopped and the crops were flooded and destroyed year after year, my Oma made several trips into China's border towns to find work and food to feed us. Our government had disappeared and everyone who had followed the rules, including my Appa, died. I didn't follow rules. I stole and bartered and learned quickly, and I survived. But when the government devalued our money and made our savings worthless, all my work became nothing at all. There was no present, and the future looked even worse. Then my monthly bleeding stopped, and I realized I was pregnant. After that brief meeting, I continued talking with the Chosun stranger on a Chinese telecom wired cellular phone that I used to smuggle goods between the two countries. I delayed making decisions while I continued to work and earn yuan. Foreign currency was the only kind I trusted anymore. The same dust clouds blew behind me as I walked to the Chinese border. It opened its large mouth to receive and release dried fish, iron ore, pine mushrooms, and other goods that we floated over in plastic sacks to our Chinese partners across the Tumen River after paying our bribe. Unless we were pretty and poor, then we could pay with our bodies. I started across the narrow bend of river at the cars and the blue and red tiled roofs bright in the sun, and imagined who, on the other side, I might become. There was no dream possible on our side of the river, and a child with only a mother would be a second-class citizen. I didn't rush and made contact with a broker trolling our border towns for prospective brides to marry unwed Chinese men. This woman with leathery hands approached me at the market, then quickly pulled me away so that we could talk in private and out of danger. She made me offers. This man, they say, has one of those wobbly, not-so-strong hearts, but he's a meek one, so you can do what you want. That one's a farmer living in the countryside and owns a lot of livestock. A landowner. You know what a landowner is, right? And this one's a businessman. What business? I said. Business, the marriage broker replied, and looked offended. I thought of telling her about the baby I was carrying, how the man was a powerful local kanbu who had protected my growing smuggling business, and laughed. This businessman could have strange sexual desires or be violent. The farmer could be as old as my grandfather. Rumors traveled through the markets, and I had heard of such marriages. But the harmless-looking man who had arranged our brief meeting a week ago on the frozen river, this sometimes tour guide with his seesaw limp and sun-beaten face, He was real. Even though my Oma was famous for not showing until her 5th month, I was afraid my body would start to betray me. Leaving wasn't a choice anymore. It was Oma or my baby. After the broker that the Joseon man had hired bribed a chain of local officials, after I bribed still others to register me dead of tuberculosis to protect my Oma, I left while she was sleeping. It was safer for her not to know much. I packed the essentials, nothing personal, and passed the village walls without looking back. I believed I was good at not looking back. Maybe it was 2 or 4 in the morning when I finally crossed, but all the hours feel the same when you're terrified and ready to end your life if caught. Against the mountain peaks rising like dull knives, the moon stalked our half-naked group wading across the shallow river. The moonlight made us as translucent as ghosts. It was as if we were shedding our very selves to become someone else. It'll hurt, the broker leading us had warned. Hurt wasn't the right word for crossing in early spring. Pain needled up my leg. I blew out white clouds too thick, too visible. I tried to stop breathing. Halfway across, I heard what sounded like a gun. We dropped deep into the water, and my hand rose up to beat away a bullet that never came. Like the thousands before me since the famine, I shadowed the broker's exact watery steps to avoid the man traps along the shore in the gaze of China's cameras. I could only ask myself, why didn't I cross before the river's sudden thaw? Finally, shivering, colder than I've ever been, I dragged myself up the muddy bank and kneaded my numb fingers and toes. When I found them still there, I felt light, almost happy. I looked for the man who would be my husband, for now. His thin arms, his chestnut brown face, anything to reduce the scale of that country suddenly too large for me.
Start our Q&A and a panel discussion, so I'd like to invite the authors up to the couch. So,
Can you hear me?
No testing. Can you hear?
We can pass it back and forth.
Testing. Can you hear me back there? Good. Okay.
Okay, great. I'm just going to kick off the Q&A, and then we want to open it up to audience questions. And I know that Krys and Barbara are definitely looking forward to hearing from you. So please think about your questions and any comments you might have as well. So just to begin, I know that both of you focus a lot on narrative storytelling and on the scale of individual stories. To say something larger about North Korean society and history and politics. And so, but you work in different kind of genres, so nonfiction and fiction, and Barbara, you're a journalist, but your book often reads like this novelistic plunge into 6 characters' lives. And you have chapters titled The True Believer, and The Bartered Bride, and Krys, you actually had to work also with kind of the slate of experience with refugees as well, but you translated this into fiction and 3 central characters. So for both of you, I'm wondering why you chose to feature multiple voices, as well as why were the characters or people you chose the ones that were important to you and that you chose to share those stories?
In my case, since I was working with nonfiction, I wanted to have multiple voices because there's always a lot of suspicion about North Korean defectors. And not just North Koreans, any kind of refugee defector, you're never quite sure if what they are telling you is true. So, is there some feedback here? By picking 6 people from one town, I was able to more or less cross-check what they were saying. If if they said, in 1996 we used to see dead children by the Sukjong stream, and you heard it, separately from various people, you would believe it. And in addition, the 6 people in my book, there were 2 couples, so to speak, a couple, a boyfriend and girlfriend, and a mother and daughter. And so I interviewed them separately, and I really had this heavy burden of, making sure it was true, because I'm a journalist, and it's very hard to fact check. And there have been other cases where North Korean defectors have, exaggerated, and it's caused, some scandal, which is unfortunate because the truth is bad enough. There's no need to exaggerate. But again, these 6 people, I believe them within, a shadow of doubt, because their stories meshed so neatly. And in terms of how I picked the 6, they were people who I guess I liked and they liked me, because it required, an enormous amount of their time to interview them. I mean, I down to what they were wearing, what the weather was like, and I was doing this by, a journalist standard, which meant I couldn't pay them anything. And, this was a bit of an issue because, I don't know if it's still like this in Seoul, but there was sort of a tradition of giving defectors like $100 sort of transit money for an interview. It wasn't big money, and certainly the Japanese media did that, and it was hard to explain that I couldn't do that. I mean, I could give them gifts. Dr. Kim, I took her to see a Russian performance of Swan Lake. That was her. That was her gift. Somebody else, I gave a copy of George Orwell's 1984. But it was like, we all had a lot of lunches, but a lot of long lunches. So I got along with these people, and they were also good storytellers because I couldn't make it up. And so this Dr. Kim, which is her real name, she told me, the story about her crossing the river and seeing the rice on the patio floor and realizing that that was for the dog. And she told the stories in a way that made them compelling. Not everybody does. I found in general interviewing refugees and defectors, the ones who are too well educated can't tell a story. I don't know why that is. There's a woman in my book who worked in a market who had no education, and she was probably the best storyteller of all. And I guess it was wanting to also create a somewhat balanced portrait of North Korea. I picked people who were not activists. Most of them were like Dr. Kim. They came across sort of accidentally for some reason. They didn't intend to escape. Most of them were pretty loyal to the regime before they left. And, well, I guess, those were my 6. I mean, it appears you had 3, and were they all 3 sort of based on people you knew or imagined?
I mean, the great thing about fiction, of course, you have a lot more license in some ways as well. Because I'm a fiction writer, I love nonfiction and fiction. I love the graphic novel. I was very interested to talk to you about that later, really curious. I love all forms of writing, but my impulse is always towards poetry or fiction, my first loves. And part of it is that what drives me so often is not the discovery of learning the things that I can find out by facts or research or that, but to the mystery, the endless question mark of, again, the woman who never crossed. What happened to her? And because that haunted me, to fill in that story for her, to imagine the life that might have happened, and has happened to many people. So that's kind of the impulse towards the fiction and the stories. But there was a story that I wrote in Drifting House that was about the famine and the children that crossed. And of course, I had read Barbara's book and been very moved by those accounts. And then at a certain point, I think, I hadn't ever planned on writing this book. I'd actually tried to write a very different book until I realized that there was a North Korean friend of mine who came to me with 5 years worth of diary entries, and he said, please write my story. Please put it in a book. And I didn't use those diaries, but he and other friends convinced me that maybe it's okay to go to the material that I actually know best, that I'm most comfortable with, and that I care a lot about. So that became that the next phase, I think, in some ways, like not what happened during the famine, but what happened after the famine. What's happening, close to today, this contemporary times, and bringing the narrative, I think, that we're still filling in, and more books will tell us, other things, and that was what I was interested in this case. And the characters themselves, there's a Chinese-Korean character, as the Joseonjuk, as they're called, that live at the border area. And one of my characters is Chinese-Korean who immigrates to America and then comes back for various reasons. He was important to me because he was the start of the book in some ways, because I'd read about the Chinese-Korean homeless kids who sometimes joined gangs of North Korean homeless kids that are refugees, of course, that have crossed the river, called Gochebi in their own country. And they were kind of a buffer because they could go places and be legally safe. They could be safe. They could go ask questions. They were able to do things and scout in a way that the North Korean kids couldn't. And they also knew the language. So that really that interested me. And again, it's the thing that I don't know that interests me, the thing that I can't know in a way. So he became that character, and he has relationships with the missionary background. His mother's a missionary, and my father was a pastor. I grew up in the church, and I'm always fascinated. Every book I write, in some ways, turns to power, God, organized religion, and corruption. So, tell what a lovely early education I had. But there's probably some PKs in here, and if you know what I'm saying, you know what I'm saying. PK, pastor's kids. Regardless, he's one, and then Changmi and Yongju are the other two characters, and Yongju's from Pyongyang, and one of the elite. One of those that assumed, that for his whole life he would just have everything handed to him, would have a very clear, he saw the clear path, and thinks that nothing, that he is one of those untouchables. Because I've heard this story in some way so many times, the people who think that nothing can ever happen to them, and so in some ways stop caring about what happens to other people until it happens to them. So I wanted him there, and I wanted Changmi, who's the other character, because first I just love strong, struggling women who have no help except for their own wits and their own strength, and whether they have to be manipulative or whether they have to walk 20 miles, that's the woman who's going to do it, and she is that woman. And also because she was someone who had no one to take care of her, had to learn to grow up very early. And those are characters I feel very close to. And I want them to do well, and I want them to survive. But I don't know at the beginning what's going to happen to these characters. I just hope they're going to make it, as a fiction writer. So I just wanted some kind of balance in some ways, but I also wanted Danny there as a witness, as that Chinese-Korean witness who knew more than they did in some ways about the larger global perception of North Koreans, as well as the political problems and the missionary and church culture that hurts and helps North Koreans.
Thank you. So I also wanted to ask about this whole project of even writing about North Korea, which is, it's as you were both talking about, it's not just aesthetic or historical or investigative. It's also very, it comes with a lot of political and ethical considerations. And as you hinted at, there's sometimes stories around veracity of people's accounts, but there's also the need to protect people's identities And as Krys has in your novel, there's also questions about the motives of people who want help and set up safe houses and so on. So I'm wondering, when in the process of writing, what were some of the most kind of important political or ethical considerations that you had? You know, was it about, I know that, you know, you were working in different genres, but was there something very important to you about preserving people's accounts and memories, or was there some sort of urgency or motivation that compelled you?
Well, this is really a problem when you're doing nonfiction, because, you know, we're not supposed to make it up. We're not supposed to, you know, change dates and ages, and it was a struggle. I mean, it was easier in my book because you know, the subtitle of the book is Ordinary Lives in North Korea, and the people were ordinary. And you know, even since the book came out, like there's this woman who worked in the market. I've met like 20 women just like her who have the same story. I interviewed a family while I was living in South Korea of defectors who had stolen a boat and come to South Korea, and I spent quite a lot of time with them. I had a photographer, and you know, they knew who I was and what I was doing, and you know, blah 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 blah. But then they freaked out and decided they didn't want their story told because it was too easy to figure out who they were, because they, you know, were very unusual because they had taken this boat. And I killed the story. You know, it involved like 2 weeks worth of work, and you know, my editors were not happy. And I mean, you know, from a journalistic standpoint, I was well within my rights to publish. You know, they had done, you know, we had changed names, but it didn't matter. You know, and I realized that their relatives at home would be penalized, because that's what happens. You know, ordinary North Koreans who leave for China, nothing really happens to their family if they haven't been, you know, activists or involved with the church. Even if they go to South Korea, if they're not, you know, too vocal, nothing happens. But if they really speak up and speak to the foreign media, their family back home will be penalized. So, you know, it is an issue, and it's one of the things that keeps North Koreans from telling their story, and it's also something that keeps them from telling the full facts of their story. They don't want to be identified.
It's true. They often change things not because they're being, you know, you're trying to deceive people, but because they know they're thinking about their relatives back home. Yeah. In my case, I say the ethical dilemma, I mean, as a fictional dilemma, was the responsibility to tell the truth and yet to free the story and to really allow myself to be a fiction writer. That was a struggle, and which I had. That's why it probably took many more years than it should have to finish this book. But the ethical dilemma would be really the missionary culture for me, the aid workers, this idea of helping people, because there are some very good people who do help North Koreans who are religious. I mean, most of the community that's helping North Koreans on the NGO level, as well as within more unofficial activism, which is where a lot of the dangerous work happens, are Christian. And yet, how do I both acknowledge that and yet expose, I think, or what for me was the great shock, and that is we're all human beings, whether you are a political leader or you are a religious leader, you are going to be an individual first, and that individual might have very strong motivations that is about food and safety first, and a religious mission later, like Justice for North Korea's Pastor Chung, a real person who risked his life to get people out many times, and there's many unnamed people who are like that, or the vast majority who may be religious, but also have a family to feed, don't have many economic skills, anything to offer except to hold on to people and receive church subsidies in order to live. Or people who are associated with gangs, and they are the ones that make the fake IDs. Or I actually had lunch with a gang member at the border area before, and for them it's a business, and this kind of a business where China does not acknowledge that an entire nation of people, when they cross, are not actually refugees, but are going to send them back to great danger or camps or incredible punishments. They don't have any rights, and to fall into the wrong hands leads to all sorts of terrible situations that wouldn't happen if China were a more just nation.
So I just wanted to ask a question about borders and identity and belonging. Since both of you really looked at the stories of people who are living either on the border or are often crossing the border. And so for Barbara, all 6 of your accounts focus on the people of Cheongjin. And Krys, your novel has characters that cross the border from North Korea into China. And it seems that, as you said, what awaits on the other side is very dependent on the very specific ways they do cross. It's not that North Korea is monolithic and everything is the same, and it's not that China's border region is at all as well. And it is striking that the title of your novel is How I Became a North Korean. It's not being North Korean, or it's not about that. So for both of you, I was wondering how did the border and looking at border towns and people who've crossed, how was it a part of what you chose to write? And did it reveal anything to you about life as a North Korean, or about North Korean kind of identity and how they felt about the state and themselves? And yourselves, actually, in your position in relation to North Korea.
I think the thing that I found the most interesting when I was working with North Korean defectors was, their reactions in China. And, I read the excerpt about the woman who sees the food for the dog, but every North Korean I met, went through this, great, almost an epiphany when they came to China. And there's another woman in the book who, is obsessed with, she's staying in a farmhouse in China, and she's obsessed with the rice cooker, because it, knows when the rice is cooked and bings every morning, and that's like her wake-up call. I've met so many North Koreans in China, and they're fascinating. I once interviewed a guy who had just come out like a week before, and we were in a farmhouse. It was so close, you could see North Korea across the river, and he was watching South Korean TV. In this part of China, you can get South Korean television, and it's just, I saw his, the way his jaw was open, the watching, the ads for the microwave and the mobile telephones and the HGTV, and it was just, he was amazed, because the North Koreans are really these, these modern day Rip Van Winkles. They come out, they've been, stuck in the 1960s, and they come out and they see this world, and I just never got tired of hearing their stories about arriving in China. And this part of China is actually not a very prosperous part of China, and Yanji, which is the main, it's like the capital of the Yan Autonomous District, it's the sort of Korean capital, is really a dump. I mean, it's, if you went there, you would say, like, what a shithole. And I've been there many times. I can't believe I'm here again. But these people would arrive from North Korea, and they would get to Yanji, and it was like they were in Paris. They'd talk about the lights and the color and the fashion and the food. And it reminded me of this story that you used to hear about the train from Moscow to Paris, that when the train from Moscow would stop in Warsaw, the Russians would always think they were in Paris. And when the people were coming from Paris and the train stopped in Warsaw, they would think they had already reached Moscow. But India is kind of like that. And, you know, it was really a place where you could see how a border makes a difference and how dramatically different life is on one side or another. And that's the terrible tragedy of North Korea. I mean, it is like, you know, in the middle of this great economic miracle, you know, the lights all around. There's, you know, Japan and South Korea and China, you know, just like miracle growth. And, you know, North Koreans are just, you know, stuck there in that black hole, wrong side of the border.
I suppose I should address the border in terms of my title too. Borders have always been interesting to me, partially I think as someone who crossed from Korea to America, then ended up finding out, oh, my scholarship can go overseas. So I ended up in England, and then from England to South Korea, and then the Rome Prize brought me to Rome. And so it's this idea of home and belonging and citizenship, where you belong, who lets you in, who keeps you out, are things that I've always been interested in. When I was in Rome about a year and a half ago, my my bag was stolen. There's one or two people in here who know about that. It was ripped off my shoulders by two guys on a motorcycle. And I thought, my passport is in there. I have no evidence of what country I belong to. Every shred of my identity is in that bag. Will I be able to prove that I exist? Was the question I asked myself. And it's something that really drove the book, in a sense. Identity, political identities, personal identities. When you live in a country and you don't leave the country, you might not in some ways be interrogating yourself as much. I say you in the general, but you might ask yourself, what does it mean to be American? Or maybe you do. Well, these days we certainly do. But to leave suddenly defines the place you are and then the place you left in a way that's sometimes quite painful. And so this idea of the border between these two countries, one country of great wealth, China, this other country that is, you know, a pest in China's side in some ways, that's being stripped of all its natural resources. And this idea of becoming North Korean, in the sense that once you leave, suddenly these people are persecuted, are sometimes made into slaves on farms, are sold into marriages, are abused, are turned in for money, are all sorts of things that happen to them because of their nationality. And then when they cross into South Korea, they might want to become one kind of person. They think, oh, well, this is a new life, a new start. I take on a new name. I have so many North Korean friends who have legally changed their name from a less North Korean sounding one to a South Korean sounding one. But as soon as they open their mouth, we're sitting at a restaurant, people start looking at them funny, and many of them get either angry or self-conscious or ashamed. And again, they are suddenly made aware that they are North Korean. But a minute ago, when we were talking, we were just two people sharing and being friends with each other. And so this identity that's imposed on us, and that I think, again, is something that happens to many of us. So, but it's something that we struggle with, and it's something that North Koreans struggle with. The border that is of this border, my book is dedicated very intentionally. I knew the dedication very early on in the book. It was to those who have crossed. And it's about this border, but I was thinking about all borders. I thought about Mexico and the United States. I thought very much about Europe, though I had no idea that it was going to escalate to the scale that it has. But these borders that surround us, and the borders that we create, borders of misunderstanding that we create between us, are things that really shaped the way I understood my book.
Thank you. So now I'd like to open up the floor for questions from the audience. We can take a few, so raise your hand if you have them. Over there?
Um,
If you don't mind saying loudly.
yeah, sure. Sorry. No, I can just shout. It's fine. My question to both of you. I'm also a journalist and writer who have covered Syrian refugees that have come here. How in writing this group of people who are so steeped in preconception, how do you keep their stories from becoming spectacle? Is that something you think about? Barbara, you mentioned sort of like an obsession that first stoked, your foray into this feat. How do you write these people with dignity and respect as opposed to making them this sort of like lighted up thing?
I think the whole point of the reporting, I mean, I think, my reporting, but some of the coverage I see of Syrian refugees as well, is to get American readers, in my case, to empathize with people whose names they can't pronounce from a different country. And, the people I picked for my book, I picked, a school teacher, a doctor, a housewife, a young intellectual, a homeless boy. In a way, people could identify, Americans could say, what would I do if I were in that situation? And the food ran out in my country and I had to protect my kids. And you're supposed to see yourself in them. And I've seen that in a lot of the better reporting about the Syria crisis as well.
Sorry, what was the question again? I seem to have lost the...
It was about,
Go ahead.
I think in terms of writing about North Koreans, how to write them without making them a spectacle and imbuing them with dignity and respect.
Well, I think that even though we're writing in very different genres, I've always sensed that we come from very similar philosophies. And when you think of North Koreans not as capital North Koreans, but as human beings, as individuals, as the people that you have lunch with, and you talk with people who have families and ambitions, and some of them are funny, and some of them, their dream is to be a truck driver, others are like wild potters. I mean, the whole range of humanity, people who have survived so much and have maybe lost so much, but are still able to laugh and care about you and worry about your trivial problems, whereas others who will never recover in a way. And when you become involved in the individual story, it no longer becomes a spectacle. It's about a human life, and it's about the dignity of honoring that human life, I think. So it didn't become, I don't think it was a problem, but I think the danger in fiction is that you honor it to the point where you're handling it with gloves, and you really don't let yourself imagine and shape as a fiction writer. So that's more of the challenge, I'd say.
I just add something about that. I think it's especially important with North Koreans because they tend to be depicted in the foreign press as these robotic figures, goose-stepping to pins to the leadership, and they're always described as hard and inscrutable. It's like all these Asian stereotypes are sort of applied freely to North Koreans. Some of the films that were supposed to be set in China were moved to, I think it was, I can't remember which one now, but had been moved to North Korea because they were like kind of libel-proof. You could just insult North Koreans. And so I think it's very important to humanize them. Or, we don't need to humanize them, they are human, but to show, their personal side.
First of all, thank you both for being here and for reading from your books. I've read both of your books, or Barbara, I've read your book, and Krys, I've read your short stories. I'm curious to know to what extent, if at all, you're able to continue the relationships that you established with the personalities that you've met who inspired your work. I guess I'm thinking primarily in Barbara's case, in the 6 sort of real people, but Krys as well, you speak about this sort of establishing relationships with real human beings, and I wonder, first of all, if you're able to maintain the relationships, and then secondly, if you're not, how difficult is that?
I'm in touch with all the people in my book, and when I go to Seoul, I see, a couple of them, and so yeah, I still have good relations with them. I think something that was maybe not the best for reporting, but I mean, I did pick people I liked and who I got along with, and I still do. I went to one of their weddings, and I have to write a note to, if anybody can write a card for me in Korean, come up to me afterwards, because I'm struggling to write a note to somebody who had a loss in the family. But yeah, we're still friendly.
Yes, most of my friendships with North Koreans, some of them have been well over 10 years, and others, most recently like Lee, who I became friends with at a festival in Thailand last February, is a more recent friend, and of course you might have heard of her book, her memoir that has come out in the last year. So I would say that that's the most rewarding part of any friendship. Right? When you think of your friends, it's over time that you start to understand a person, you see them go through different stages of life, and it's very similar in that way. So I've seen people first come to Korea and transition and not understand anything, to seeing them going to dental school and graduating. I have seen friends who I started when I was volunteering at Link very early on, go on now to re-immigrate from Seoul to England to start again and try to make a better life for themselves than they had there. The man I helped bring out of North Korea, I just saw him a few weeks ago, and I have seen him already through 3 different relationships, working in kimchi factories, having explosive arguments. When I first came out, he threatened to all sorts of wonderful things because he had a very volatile life, had a lot of trust issues, and this time, over time, has come to trust me very much, and it's been very wonderful and very rewarding, but also very sad, because the last time I saw him, he said to me, he gave me a gift. He gave me a necklace, like a necklace he shouldn't have bought. It's expensive. And he said, "You're my only family left." And I was grateful for the fact that he said, this is the relationship that sustained me over the years. And it also just broke my heart. For so many years he's lived here, he's tried to establish families and tried to establish relationships, and he was just coming off a 1+ year relationship and returning. When I go back, the next time I visit him, it'll have to be in Gyeongju, another city altogether. He's very, there's lots of North Koreans everywhere now, and there's lots of communities, and yet that doesn't mean they bond and they form relationships. Some do. Some are lucky. Some get married. Others never quite settle. And I wanted to have more family. I wanted him to have more love in his life. So that was very sad.
Someone in the back?
As you guys shine the light in different stories through your writing, what can we do in our daily capacities to advocate for causes?
It depends on what level, but one thing that there are North Koreans who have settled here either as refugees immediately after the incredibly long wait that America requires for them to get in this country, or via South Korea, or others who are coming to study more and more in America, trying to again build the skills that will help them in any country, and they really struggle with academics because all that they studied was very different. And English, when they first come to South Korea, they don't understand Korean because there's so much English everywhere, there's so much signage that they feel like they're being confronted with a foreign language. So the people around you here, I mean, there is Liberty for North Korea, there's, it's called Link. They have volunteering services that you can work through, and it is an American-based organization. There's that possibility. In terms of donations, if you are a very busy person or you're far away from these centers, it's very helpful because there's good NGOs, there's not such great ones. Ones I really like and trust, and ones that many North Korean friends of mine have said they trust those people, the philosophy, would be Justice, Justice for North Korea, and the Citizens Alliance. In Korean, we call it 시민연합. Most of the board in Citizens Alliance is actually made of former North Koreans, as well as people who are volunteering their time and services. And they were very influential in getting they're the ones that are standing up and speaking to politicians in Geneva or in DC and getting real legal changes made in order to actually have the North Koreans recognized, the North Korean refugee crisis recognized as actually existing. It's incredible, but it took years for them to acknowledge the fact that this was happening. But those, there's a lot of people who are very, low paid and very well educated and given up their lives to really creating slow change as well as re-education programs in South Korea for the people. So I'd say that those are some 3 good organizations. If you're looking for a religious organization that also does good work, I would say Helping Hands. Tim Peters' Helping Hands.
I'll leave it at that. I think you're more up to date since you're living in Seoul now.
I'm not sure. I'm no expert and no spokesperson, but from my experience, these are the people I trust.
So I think we have time for just one more question. I'll go right here. Green shirt.
I was wondering, and I think I'm interested in hearing from Krys's perspective, especially as like a fiction writer, because you talked about how you have more creative license in building narratives and stories around people. How do you avoid writing a political bent into your characters or even your stories, especially with a topic like this, or even just in building your relationships with refugees or migrants? How do you, I'm sure, my experience is that I've worked with other immigrants or refugees, and sometimes those political struggles often come into our relationship, the way that we talk about things and their experiences. How do you avoid letting that maybe taint or stress the relationships that you try and write about, or just even in maintaining them?
The real relationships versus the characters, they're very distinct for me in some ways. But I'd say, as a fiction writer, all language is political, and all stories are political. It's impossible to avoid having, well, not impossible, but nearly impossible if you're writing fiction, to reveal your worldview. And our worldviews are very much shaped by the societies we live in. And I don't think that's a terrible thing. And so the characters are characters, you let them go, you follow them in some ways. If you try to shape them, they eventually get away from you because you discover what, in some ways writing fiction, I think, you discover what you believe in and you discover what your characters believe in and what they think, and sometimes they surprise you and may even dismay you or delight you by what you discover. But I would say every time I finish a book, and there's 2 books, going on 3 right now. I just had a talk with my editor before, talking very excitedly about the progress of my 3rd very zany book. But after I finish a book, I am no longer the same person. That book has changed me, hopefully made me a better person in some ways, has made me understand the world better and myself better in ways that it's probably one of the most rewarding things about writing a book. Because it's so painful, there has to be something other than practical paying the bills. I mean, it's a reward that really can't be measured in some ways. And that's why people we're lucky that we're here, and we're lucky that people actually even bother to read us. But there's so many writers and good writers who will not see the page or will get paid $500 for 4 years worth of work on a book. But why do they still write? It's because they believe in that process, and the process is changing them and giving them something. But I think in a way that is political, because we are all creatures negotiating our environment and our societies. So I think I think we should not be afraid of that as a writer, and trust the language, trust your characters, and trust yourself as you write.
Right, so thank you everyone for attending and
You know, eunuchs in India are rumored to have the power of the curse, so you do not piss one off.
Was writing Korean and Korean adoptee characters, and you can still actually find a story of a terrible, do not find the story, a terrible story of mine online where I published under the name Matthew Saw, which was my birth surname,